Right, here we go. I am middle-aged, middle-class, a fairly privileged white man, and I am about to present a podcast interrogating what it is like to be black in Scotland today. A little bit awkward, but it shouldn't be. What do I know about that, though? You might very well and quite properly ask, and the answer is very little. And that, though, is part of the purpose of doing this. There's a new body of work that's been published quite recently, which looks not just at racism in our country today, but more specifically, perhaps, where it has its roots. And the authors discovered that racism was taught in a pretty extreme and very specific way at one of our oldest and most prestigious universities.
If anyone thought that philosophy was irrelevant, they only have to look at the Scottish Enlightenment to see the consequences and the evil it could bring about in the world.
So here are a couple of questions. Firstly, what do we do about that legacy? And secondly, do we in modern Scotland really have a responsibility to atone now for the sins of generations past? That we're going to be discussing in part of today's episode. It came out a couple of months ago, but it was a busy week. There was a lot of other stuff happening that week, so we didn't get around to doing it. But we've kind of had an idea to kind of come back and touch on it. So that's why we are where we are today. We should also say this is a report by Edinburgh University that was designed to look at its own past and difficult racial issues in its past. It's not the only university to be doing this, though, is it?
No, and I mean, back in 2019, the University of Glasgow said it would pay £20 million worth of reparations to atone for its links in the past to the transatlantic slave trade, and it's done work on its links with colonialism, how it's profited from racism historically over the years, and that's just in Scotland. So Edinburgh has followed suit with this piece of work, which, as you say, was commissioned by the university in 2021, and I think at that time, you know, the whole world was talking more about race and racism and what it looks like in modern society. I mean, in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered by a white policeman, it prompted this whole new conversation. People will probably remember the Black Lives Matter kind of hashtag and this phrase that united a lot of protests around the world. And it touched the UK too. And one of the things that the institutions, some of them did afterwards, was look within at how have we been part of this problem? How do we continue to play a part in it today? And accepting that racism is not something that lives in the past. It's something that has a long tail and in some cases leads to a kind of embedded structural racism that we are still trying to deal with today. And this report is exploring that in a few different ways.
Right. And there will be people listening to this, watching this, who will inevitably be rolling their eyes saying, oh, it's that woke agenda nonsense, desperate to find ways to flagellate yourself about the past. But this is a proper big study, 4 years of work. And it's, I mean, as we're about to hear, it's uncovered some really interesting and significant findings. Who have they been looking at? What have they been looking at here?
So it looked back at the past and what went on at Edinburgh University, which, you know, has been going since 1583. So there was a lot to look at. And as part of that, it looked at some of what, you know, our most celebrated public intellectuals that are revered in parts of Scotland, people like Adam Smith and David Hume and Dugald Stewart, which is a less known name, but you'll hear more about it in this conversation. Yeah. Influential academics who were part of this teaching and academicisation of race and you know, perpetuating teaching that race was in some ways scientifically valid. But that is something that we're going to hear more about.
Yeah, we are. We're going to hear just now from Professor Tommy Curry, who is a Professor of Philosophy at Edinburgh University and one of the authors of this report. We're talking to you because you were one of the authors of a report that Edinburgh University commissioned to look into itself. Yes. And its history. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but for me, right, the key finding that this report achieved, among many, the key was that racist theory, racist thought was being taught by significant academics at that university at a time in history where we thought that institution was like the cradle of liberal thought that was spreading out around the world, right in the middle of the Scottish Enlightenment. And I want to know how surprised we should be by that. But first, could you just help us out a bit by just give us a bit of detail? What kind of things were people teaching then?
Well, I mean, it's quite tragic. It's not just that people taught racist theories or racist sciences during this period of time. It was really that people developed. People like Dougald Stewart, Adam Ferguson, even the controversial David Hume were actually developing different techniques to understand racial inferiority. Of particular interest during the report, we found the work of Dougald Stewart through the lecture notes of his students, and we found that he was actually teaching about American slavery. His students were hearing lectures dealing with the perspectives of people like Sam Stophold Smith, and Thomas Jefferson over the question of whether or not black people were human beings, whether they had morality or whether or not they were intelligent. And given this period of time, one of the central debates that Dougald Stewart saw himself involved in it through the lecture notes was whether or not black people's skin complexion would change from darker to lighter the more intelligent and the more moral they became. So during this period of time, philosophers at the University of Edinburgh saw skin color as being intrinsically connected to the inner qualities such as intelligence and moral character. So for those inner qualities to change, so too with their skin color and complexion.
So people's skin color changed as they developed their thoughts. I mean, it seems absolutely extraordinary and quite troubling these days to hear that kind of thing was being taught. But was that not conventional thought at the time? This wasn't specific to Edinburgh University, was it? It wasn't some racist hotbed. It was just that's how academic thinking went back then.
Well, it depends how you want to interpret the historical literature. The argument that we're talking about and really discussing is called physiognomy. It was developed in Germany by someone named Johann Lavater, and it was imported from Germany over to the UK. And during this period of time, it was being debated. Some people, even in Germany, like Immanuel Kant, had rejected physiognomy, but it had a certain uptake here in the UK, specifically Scotland.
So this was an active debate at the time, and these academics in Edinburgh fell specifically on one side of it. It wasn't just conventional wisdom.
I would say so. Physiognomy was much disputed within Germany, but in the Anglo-speaking world, it was taken up with a certain kind of veracity, so to speak, because it aligned with many of the assumptions that people like Dougald Stewart and Adam Ferguson had about racial hierarchies and racial inferiority.
Right. And how much of this did we know in the past? Is this new, this evidence that you've uncovered?
Well, I think what's new, certainly the piece about Dougald Stewart is new. Not very many people have had the opportunity to see his lecture notes. But what I think is the most interesting, the most novel part about what we've doing is that it kind of shifts the historical debate. Much of the literature and the academic scholarship has been based on the assumption that the Scottish Enlightenment had a separate trajectory from American slavery. Now what we've shown is that rather than the Scottish Enlightenment being so distant from that debate, they were actually teaching the lessons of people like Stanhope Smith and Thomas Jefferson in order to situate how they should think about race, even in Scotland.
What should we do with this information now that we have it?
Rather than simply thinking of the Enlightenment as the product of or resulting in products like liberalism, liberal democracy, and humanism, we really need to start exploring how it created kind of subhumanity. It created a standard of race and racial identification based on complexion and skin color that eliminated people from the community of human community. And that's a very serious issue. It tells us that many of the issues we have today around dehumanization and genocide and global conflicts are able to happen because certain thoughts that were fueled by the Scottish Enlightenment have solidified racial and ethnic difference to such an extent that we can't recognize people's humanity.
Well, do people want to know about this? I mean, your report's been out for a couple of months now. I want to know kind of what the response has been. When you're saying things like we must revise the way that we teach in schools and in further education across Scotland about this great period that we're so proud of, the Scottish Enlightenment, what kind of response have you received to that?
Overwhelmingly, the response to the report has been positive. I think Scotland sees itself as a progressive and liberal society, and in many cases it should. But there is the same kind of undercurrents in Scotland and the UK more generally that we find in places like the United States when it comes to conversations that want to discuss or even seriously engage the question of race and racism.
Right. So if we don't redress this in some active way, we are being racist.
Well, it's not just the question of people being racist. The issue is, how do you accept that certain people have been historically viewed as less than human? You hear their protest, you ignore it. You you reject any account of your culpability, and then you say you have a free society. The question is the hypocrisy and what that hypocrisy means for groups of people who don't feel included in democracy and who don't have the same opportunities to experience freedom.
Yeah, I'm already checking myself for that last question, actually, because I'm doing what happens so often here, is just trying to kind of split this in two. I mean, not so long ago, we were talking as a society about renaming statues and you know,
Yes.
pushing statues into harbours and whatever. And then very quickly that was used as a wedge issue, wasn't it? Something to polarise the debate and divide people. I mean, do you see this study of yours being used inevitably as part of that?
I think there are people who are going to try to draw divisions in society no matter how careful you are. We did an academic project. We had a strong research design that found things that people had not commented on before. And we're very excited about the fact that we now know the role that Dougal Stewart played. We now know more about James Kyle Pritchard and the development of the London Ethnological Society and what this means for people at the University of Edinburgh, for Edinburgh as a city, for Scotland at large. People can say this is divisive, but ask yourself, well, what about the people who've never been included? Do their voices, their suffering, does the blood that was spilled on behalf of enriching Scotlanders in the UK more broadly not matter?
Yeah, we're like as a people. Do you think we have a problem with race here?
There certainly is a problem with race here. There certainly is. And I know it becomes controversial and it excites a lot of passions when we discuss it, but there are racial divisions. And I remember when I first came to Scotland, a lot of white Scotlanders told me how different, how tolerant, how I wouldn't suffer from any of the racism that I suffered from in the United States. But when I started talking to black Scotlanders, when I started talking to them about blackness, their racial and ethnic identities and difference, they told me a vastly different story.
So do you think it's an unconscious racism?
No, I think it's actually quite deliberate in many cases. You know, once I was doing a series, it was a show called The Big Questions, and a taxi driver came to pick me up. And he said, just by looking at me, he knew that I wasn't from the UK and I wasn't from Scotland. And I asked him, how do you know that? He said, because you held your head up too high, and you don't usually see black men in Scotland do that. So there's a very real perception of how black people are supposed to act in this country, how we're supposed to behave, and what we are the place that they think or we think we should belong. And people seem to know that and communicate that to me when I don't fit that mold in this country.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, you're right when you say that Scotland, when you came here, I'm not surprised to hear you say that you kept being told that Scottish people think that we're far more liberal, progressive, egalitarian, all of that. And it will be disappointing to a lot of people, perhaps unsurprising to others, to hear you say that the reality is very different. It's not nice when the mirror is held up. But are you saying that actually as a nation we do need to accept our shortcomings and really urgently start to talk about them for this to change?
Absolutely. Changing education, changing the way that government sees itself representing, if not allowing racial and ethnic minorities to participate in the country. Those are the steps towards change. Trying to bury it down while people still hold strong racial and ethnic resentment and bias towards black people and other groups does nothing but stave off the inevitable.
I mean, people will take a sharp breath perhaps when they hear you say not allowing racial and ethnic minorities to take part in the country. Perhaps I'm misquoting you there, in the running of the country. What do you mean by that? Where do you think people are withheld from office?
Well, I don't think that it's necessarily an issue of being withheld from office. I think there's a very strong preference, at least in Scotland, for Scotlanders to look a certain way. When racial and ethnic minorities talk about their participation in government and the higher rungs of society, they don't feel necessarily in certain institutions that they're well represented. When we looked at some of the attitudes, even at the University of Edinburgh, racial minorities felt that they didn't have role models, that they weren't respected either as faculty or staff or students. There is a level of disconnect that racialized minorities have with institutions, the culture, and the way they're perceived compared to other groups.
So when Humza Yousaf, former First Minister, I think Justice Secretary at the time, made a speech.
The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. In the Scottish Government, every Director General is white. Every chair of every public body is white. That is not good enough.
It was actually quite a controversial speech at the time. That should have been a moment that we checked ourselves, should it?
It should have been a moment of reflection, right? And again, anyone can give a speech that talks about the racism of a particular place or the racism of a particular group of people. What we're saying with this report is, well, rather than start with the accusatory tone, let's look at the evidence that's accumulated over history. Why do you end up with white in positions of power? Why do you end up with so few racial and ethnic minorities, specifically black people, as students and faculty at leading global institutions like the University of Edinburgh?
And just for clarity, when you're talking about anecdotes that you've picked up, I mean, are we talking just about black members of the population here? Because let me suggest to you, I mean, look, I come from a very privileged position. I'm a white person, I wouldn't know, but I suspect, perhaps naively, that a black person walking down Sauchiehall Street or Princes Street might have a different experience to somebody of Pakistani or Indian background, simply because there are more of them in the population. Or would I be wrong?
Well, I can tell you what our data says. Our data says that they do have a different experience, but it's not just anti-blackness. We measured various racial and ethnic minorities, and they've come out to the same conclusion. Asians as well report high levels of resentment felt by white faculty and institution at the University of Edinburgh as well. And this aligns with the research in this area. Scotland doesn't have very much attitudinal data. It doesn't test its population very often, but the few studies that we have do show racial disparities and how people are affected by them across the board, be they black, Asian, etc.